This is the Anthrobiology Podcast, hosted by me, Gabby LaPera. Every 2 weeks, I interview a biological anthropologist about what makes us, us. Hi there, welcome to the Anthrobiology Podcast. This is Gabby LaPera. On today's show, I interviewed Dr. John Verano of Tulane University, and it was very, very interesting to talk to him. It's a great show, but I also wanted to warn folks that this one got a little gruesome. We talk about some of the unpleasant stuff that accompanies forensic work, and that could be hard for people to listen to. And then we also spent a solid quarter of the show, I would say, talking about an ancient Peruvian mass sacrifice of children and llamas, which also might be hard for people to listen to. And then on top of that, because this kind of difficult stuff is a part of the field, one of the things that happens in the show is there's some morbid humor, because that's just kind of how you end up dealing with it. But it's still a really good show. I just wanted to give people a heads up that there might be some stuff that makes some people uncomfortable. And that being said, Dr. Verano is the real deal. He was super nice, super kind to talk to me for as long as he did. And I honestly could have talked to him for way longer than I actually did. As usual, if you have any questions, feel free to shoot me an email at gabby.lapera@anthrobiology.com. That's GABY.LAPERA@anthrobiology.com. Articles and books will show up on the website. And, right, before I forget, hello to all of the people from the Arc and Anth podcast. There are a lot of you. Thank you so much for listening to my interview over there and then coming over here to actually listen to my show. I really appreciate it. Y'all are super cool. And there's, like I said, so many of you. I wasn't really expecting that. I hope you enjoy the show. I'm looking forward to getting to know y'all too. All right, let's get started. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Anthrobiology Podcast. This is Gabby LaPera. I am talking to Dr. Verano of Tulane University. Today, I am talking to him via Skype. I was supposed to be in New Orleans, but coronavirus is a thing now. So here we are on the internet. Isn't the modern age wonderful? Anyway, Dr. Verano, like I said, works at Tulane University, and within Tulane University, he also works at the Doris Z. Stone Laboratory for Biological and Forensic Anthropology. So you know that he's got a lot of really interesting things to say. Hello, Dr. Verano. How are you?
Hey, I'm doing great considering. I have the same challenges you do, but things are pretty good here right now.
Well, that's good to hear. Do you want to tell my listeners a little bit about what you do?
Well, sure. Traditionally, I call myself a biological anthropologist because I'm trained in human osteology, but also archaeology, field recovery. My specialty really is human skeletal remains, and that can be from prehistoric or historic sites, or it can be in the forensic context. We apply the same types of tools to analyze and try and explain those things. I've also drifted into mummies a few times because I work in Peru, primarily, where mummies are very common. And so I've found a number of them, and I've studied others over the years. And at Tulane, we happen to have 2 Egyptian mummies that were given to us in the 1850s. What I do more commonly is known these days as bioarchaeology.
You know what the best part about being a biological anthropologist is, or a bioarchaeologist? In my humble opinion.
In your opinion? Oh, yeah, tell me.
It's that when you're an archaeologist, you can spend months just digging around, not finding anything. But when you're a bioarchaeologist, you only ever get called when they've already found something.
Well, that is true. It's partially true, but not always, because I do work with archaeological teams, and I've been on projects where we're looking for a cemetery, or on a forensic case where you're looking for a missing person, you're looking for a body. We don't always find everything. Sometimes don't find anything in a season. Now, I will say that I often get called in, as you imagine, and that's correct. I often get called in by archaeologists who say, look, we found this human sacrifice site. This is the kind of stuff you like. Could you come and join us? And then I am kind of getting it the easy way. The material has either been excavated or they're inviting me to come finish excavating it. And then, I have money in the bank. I have material that's there at my fingertips. So it certainly beats having a field season where you don't find anything. And you're right, many archaeologists have those. They're looking for a building or they're looking for a tomb or something else and they just can't find it. So I feel sorry for them.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah.
I think that one of the things that I've heard you mention now multiple times is that you do both forensics and bioarchaeology. What is kind of the overlap there for you?
Well, the overlap is that it's in the context, really, that the way I try and explain forensic anthropology. Any science can be a forensic science if what you're doing can be introduced as expert testimony in a courtroom. What a forensic anthropologist is officially, at least in most cases, we are useful when a body is decomposed so that it can't be recognized the way you would normally roll a drawer open and show somebody a body and say, oh my God, that's somebody I know. Or if it's badly burned or fragmented, or if it's completely skeletonized, if it's just a skeleton. We are osteologists, so the expertise we bring to a forensic case is figuring out things like what we call the biological profile. What was the age at death? Can we estimate that? The sex, is it male or female? How tall were they, the stature? And then, if we're lucky, also ancestry. And the police, if they have a missing person, for example, they want to know, are they white, black, Hispanic, Asian? Can you say? And if we can, then we can help them narrow down their list of missing persons and say this possibly could be that person or not. Now, beyond that, then we can also recognize bone trauma. So if there's a gunshot wound or if there's a fracture or other injuries to the skeleton, we're experts in skeletal trauma, more than a pathologist would be who would be looking just at x-rays or at soft tissue. So that's something we do. We're often asked also to estimate time since death, and that can be pretty vague. And instead of being asked, was it 2 hours ago when this person died, we're being asked, was it a week, a month, a year, 2 years, and so on. So that's an area that we work in, and that's, of course, where a lot of research has been done over the last 20 years or so by University of Tennessee and other universities with strong forensic programs that have, I'm sure you've heard of the Body Farm,
right?
University of Tennessee, and there's one at Texas State San Marcos, and there are several others in the United States. So I don't have one. I don't have a body farm, and probably a good thing uptown New Orleans, there's not a lot of room for one. I think the neighbors, we're a very understanding city, and there's a lot of, decay and decrepitude in this city, being as old as it is, but no one seems to like dead bodies in their backyard.
Yeah, no, I've sensed that from people. I was wondering, you talked about understanding time of death. Have you been brought skeletons in what is originally a forensic context and then perhaps realized that it's not a forensic, or vice versa?
That does happen, and it happens in some places more than others. For example, in Peru, if you die on the coastal desert and let's say you're shallowly buried or just lying out in the desert, you'll naturally mummify. And mummies also last thousands of years there. So it does happen with some frequency in Peru where there's a construction site and a mummy rolls out of the side of the pit. And the question is it modern or ancient? And of course, the immediate clues would be if it's wearing shoes, if it has a cell phone or something like that, then you know it's modern. And if it's wrapped in cotton textiles with ceramics and things, you can guess it's probably ancient. So that happens a lot in Peru, and I've seen several cases where something's been found in a looted cemetery and they want to know that. In the United States, it's usually pretty clear, although mummies can be produced by unusual circumstances, like somebody, say, in a dry, cold basement or some other context where the body doesn't decompose as fast. And then it gets to be a question of, how long was that body down there? So I've dealt with some of those too.
Yeah, I've got to say, so I've also had the pleasure of getting to see mummies and work with one mummified individual. But I don't know if pleasure is the right word. I guess this is an anthropology podcast, so it is. It is in this context.
That's okay. You can say pleasure. I understand totally because, nothing against mummies, but they're very complicated, particularly in where I work in Peru, because they're often wrapped in in many, many layers of textiles. And some of these textiles are absolutely beautiful, museum quality, some of the finest textiles ever made. And that means you have to conserve them. You have to have textile specialists. You have to have facilities and storage and all that. So, if given a choice, if you came to me and said, "Would you like a mummy or would you like a skeleton?" Let's say it was a restaurant. You had wait a minute, we're not eating them. But anyway, if you brought me that choice, for a research project, I would be much happier to take a skeleton because I could just take it out of the box, lay it on the table, then look at it and measure it and do all the things that we do with skeletons. If it's a mummy, it has to be X-rayed, CT scanned, all of those things, which I enjoy doing. In fact, it was 2 weeks ago, I CT scanned some animal mummies. They're from Egypt, ancient Egypt. They were given to Tulane, and I did it with an undergraduate student who's doing her honors thesis on this. So the Children's Hospital in New Orleans, they were kind enough to say, bring them down when we have a quiet moment, we'll do it, and we'll give you the images, no charge. And they like doing it because it's something different from the daily, clinical stuff that they have to do nonstop. My student is now looking at them and trying to figure out what the bones are inside. Apparently there are 2 cats and there's an ibis.
Yeah.
And then there's a snake.
I think that this is something that a lot of people are not familiar with, is that Egyptians mummified all sorts of things, and including they would sometimes mummify animals as offerings at temples. And there's actually this huge black market for fake mummies. Because, it's whenever someone sees a business opportunity, right? Even in ancient Egypt, it's a lot cheaper and easier to pass off a fake cat mummy than it is to actually mummify a cat.
Yes, particularly if you like cats. But yeah, and these we had no knowledge. We thought they probably were legitimate because they were brought in at the same time that our human mummies were brought in the 1850s. And we do know that there are hundreds of thousands, if not a million, cats and baboons and other things at Saqqara, one single site in Egypt. And they had so many they didn't know what to do with when, there's still, I don't know, thousands of them that have not been excavated. But they did do some fake ones too, just like shrunken heads, which I've dealt with too, because a lot of museums have what they call hivero tsansas, or shrunken heads. And it turns out most of those are fakes also. Some of them are really human heads, but they're modern human heads, probably stolen from graves. And then some of them are monkey heads, and some of them are other things, animal skins made to look like shrunken heads. So I've dabbled in that area too, a little bit.
Yeah, that was one of the things that my supervisor at the Smithsonian, he spent a lot of time just trying to figure out, like, is this real or is this not? But
wait, which museum were you at? Was this natural history?
I was at Natural History. I worked for Doug Owsley.
Oh, wonderful. Yeah, I worked with Doug Owsley for 7 years. Yeah.
He's wonderful.
He's wonderful, and he's great. And in fact, he still has one of my fake shrunken heads. Not that he stole it from me, but he borrowed it for his lab, and I need to get it back sometime. It's an animal skin head that an old girlfriend of mine gave me that she had gotten at her museum, and they didn't want it. So it's been bouncing around. Maybe I need to get in touch with Doug again.
So back to the mummies.
Okay.
One thing that people probably don't realize is that mummies have a scent to them.
Yes. Mm-hmm. And sometimes it's pleasant. And when it's Egyptian, it's very pleasant. Some of the New World ones don't smell that good. And I guess it's a matter of taste. But the problem is that a mummy forms, by kind of freezing decomposition at a certain point. And it's very stable. A mummy is very stable unless it gets wet, or if it's very humid, and if mold starts growing on things like that. So, yeah, you can begin to smell bad again, unfortunately. But the ones that we have and the wrappings smell wonderful. I used to pass around in my classroom until they took them away from me and said, the conservator said, you really shouldn't keep them in a Ziploc bag. They're very carefully conserved now. But I would pass around a Ziploc bag and I'd say, who wants to know what a mummy smells like? You don't have to sniff the bag, but you can. And I'd pass it around, and everyone loved it because it smelled like old books and old attic. Everybody had their own impression of it. And they were the wrappings, and they were smelling like resin and probably some of the herbs and other frankincense and myrrh and other things that they put on mummies. So, they can be pleasant or not.
Or not so pleasant. Yeah. I remember there was one mummy that I guess when all is said and done, smelled good, but smelled exactly like roast lamb. And I remember
Yeah.
this was right around Easter, and I went home and I was like, no, thank you.
Yeah, I've had the same thing, and I hate to say it, but this is in the forensic context. If you have burned bodies, they often smell like barbecue. They smell like roast because that's what they are,
Mm-hmm.
basically flesh that's been burned. So if you've had to work on one of those bodies, if it's fresh, it's not unpleasant at all. But if you have the mixture of burned flesh and decomposition, it can really steer you away from eating meat for a while, I think.
Yeah,
Uh,
it can definitely be very overwhelming.
yes, yes.
So,
Well, on that note, most of the things I work with, that's another reason I like to do bioarchaeology is, I've been going to Peru now 35 years in a row. As a graduate student, I got invited for the first time to join a 5-year archaeological project, and that became my dissertation. And I keep going back to Peru. I love archaeological material. I don't have to worry about things that don't smell good. They have fantastic preservation there. Skeletons are just beautiful. Everyone's jealous. Everyone, whenever I give slideshows to people who work in other areas of the world, they're terribly jealous. And there are also interesting questions to ask about warfare, human sacrifice, ancient surgery, you name it.
yeah, definitely. I was reading one of your papers that I will post on my website because the entire text is up there for free.
Mhm.
And you examined a mass child and camelid sacrifice site
Oh, yes.
in
Mhm.
Peru. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, that came about like many of the sacrifices I've worked with, usually as an accidental discovery that then an archaeologist realized, oh, this is something interesting and invites me to get involved. And in this case, it was in 2014. A colleague of mine, a Peruvian, native Peruvian who was studying at Yale, got his PhD there just recently. He said, look, John, let's have lunch sometime. I want to tell you about this site. And it was a site that was found purely by accident. And it was one of those stories that people find kind of amusing. It was on a sandy hillside right across the street from a house where an Italian man and his kids lived. And his kids would walk past this place on their way to school and back. And they kept bringing in bones after school from this sandy area, both human and then some llama stuff and some fur and so on. So the father got tired of them bringing them this stuff, and he contacted the archaeologist. He said, "Look, please, there seems to be something up here. Could you take a look at it?" And so Gabriel was his name, and he went over there and looked, and he, being an archaeologist, he actually grew up in the town right next to this site, and he recognized that it was ancient material. He could recognize that there were llama bones, camelid bones, and fur, and he could recognize children's bones and textile. And so he went to the mayor of the town, got permission to do an emergency excavation, got some funding, dug a small unit. He thought maybe he'd find one or two other children intact, so he could say something more about it. And he found, as it turned out, 48 children and more llamas than that. I forget exactly how many, 60 or 70. And this was just in a small unit about 10 feet by 10 feet, or maybe 15 feet by 15. So he told me about this, over lunch, and I said, well, kids and llamas in the sand, is there any architecture? Is there any context? And in the beginning, I thought, where's the story? But then once he showed me pictures of it, I went, oh my God, this is amazing, beautiful stuff. We didn't know about child sacrifice in this culture, which is the Chimu state or empire. So it was something that no one knew about. So I said, I'll go to National Geographic and let's put in a grant proposal. They said, yes, we want to fund it. So we did another season. We doubled the number of children. And then we realized we weren't quite through. So we went back and asked for an emergency grant just to take a little bit more of it out. So we did 3 field seasons, basically. And we ended up with, almost 140 children and more than 200 llamas. And so my job, of course, was to help excavate. I took graduate students down there with me who did a beautiful job at cleaning burials. But we also took them into the laboratory and figured out the basic things. What ages are they? Are they boys? Are they girls? We couldn't really say that from the skeleton, but we've done DNA now that shows that they were both. And how were they killed? And we could show definitively that it was not a cemetery, it was not natural deaths, not an epidemic. These kids all had their chests cut open, as did the llamas, in the same spot, the same way, presumably to take their hearts out. We have some partial mummification, but we can't prove that the hearts are missing, but that's pretty much what it must be. So we now have a type of sacrifice that never was recognized before. And since the time of that article, we've moved on to 1, 2, 3 other sites in the same area that also have sacrificed children. We now have at the other site, over 200 children at one site, and then we have about 100 at another. So, they just don't stop coming.
Do you know why this happened?
We do, at least we have one working hypothesis for the site that you read about, and Gabrielle noticed it right away, it never rains in Peru unless you have an El Nino Southern Oscillation event, and many people know about the El Ninos now. For Peru, it's a particularly disastrous thing because super warm waters from Ecuador come down. It causes torrential rainfall. It also warms up the sea, so it either kills or drives the normal sea life away. So for a fisherman, all of your fish disappear, at least the ones you're used to seeing. And the rains can come and cause flash flooding, like in California, but worse. So what we found at this site, it was at the bottom of a little gully that kids walk up and down at school every day today. And there was this massive flow of mud that came down over this area. And then the kids are all, their burial pits are dug right through it.
Just to be clear, it's modern school children using the gully, but the mud is from the ancient site.
I'm sorry. Yeah, it's ancient. And they've had El Ninos since, and I've seen several of them, including one that washed out the road just nearby there, but it took a different route when the water came down. But this was ancient mud, and we know it's ancient mud in part because there are footprints there, bare human footprints of children. There's an adult sandal footprint. There are llama footprints, and so animals and humans came down while the mud was still wet, and they dug all these pits in there. Now, we can't prove that they sacrificed them to stop the rains, but that's one possible, it's the only explanation we know of at the moment. Perhaps this was such a crisis for an empire that was based on intensive agriculture, because these floods also flood out the fields. And today it is a disaster, but of course they can call on international aid or things to try and mitigate situations. But it causes today destruction of houses, sometimes epidemics from mosquitoes and other insects that just take off, and from polluted water. So this was probably a disaster for them.
I was going to say, this is a weirdly timely topic, just trying to understand how people from different time periods react to giant natural disasters or epidemic.
Yes, that's why I'm tempted to think of sacrificing some children here in New Orleans, but I don't think it'll work, and I don't think I'll be very popular. But anyway, that's the best idea we have at the moment. At the other sites, we don't have as much evidence of rain and mud, but some of the other site that has a lot of them is on a hillside, on top of the hill, and the water would just run off, so you wouldn't have the mud accumulation that we had. So that's our working hypothesis. It somehow, it makes some sense. So many people say, why would you kill your own children? I mean, it's your future. They didn't kill all their children, of course, but this was an empire that covered, hundreds and hundreds of miles up and down the coast.
That was actually something that I saw in there. You said that the children seem to have come from heterogeneous sites.
Yes, the cranial shaping of the skull, which was commonly done in ancient Peru, they did it in different ways on the coast and in the highlands, and so there's some kids that clearly don't belong there in terms of coastal population.
And
there
sorry,
are others,
when you say cranial shaping, do you mean cranial modification?
Yeah, we mean cranial modification.
And this is something that ancient peoples did as just a thing that they did, or I don't think a lot of listeners will be familiar with that.
They may not be, because there are almost no cultures in the world today that practice it. And so it's something that was quite common in the Andes. Sometimes it's accidental, and the accidental form, some of the listeners will understand this because I'll explain in a second. On the coast, they cradle boarded children. That is, they would tie them to a cradle board, and that was one way they could carry them with them, like out to the field. You could park your child against a tree or something, I guess, and that would flatten the back of the head, the back of the occipital area. If they're cradle boarded as infants, the skull is quite soft then, and so it flattens it. And it'll stay flat like that for the rest of their life. Now, we're getting similar things to this, or we got it for a while when there was this movement because of SIDS, sudden infant death syndrome. There was a recommendation, put children on their backs to sleep. Back to sleep, it was a big program. And what they found was that parents who put their kids always on the back to sleep, if the mattress was firm, they would get flattening on the back of their skulls. And then the pediatrician would recommend they wear a little helmet to try and get the shape back to normal. So now they're recommending turning the kids like on a barbecue or something, so that you're not just on the back of the head. Now in the highlands and in some parts of the coast far to the south, instead of cradle boarding, what they did was wrap bands of cloth around the head, and it would go across the forehead and then go across the lower back of the head, and that would result in a head that was taller and more rounded, kind of a cone-shaped head. Mm-hmm. And there are a number of children in this sample who you might call coneheads because their skulls have that shape. You'll never get that from cradle boarding. You will get it from wrapping the head, and wrapping the head was common in the northern highlands just above where this site is. So that to me suggests that these children are ethnically diverse, and that perhaps either they called for sacrifices from remote villages, or maybe there was immigration into the big city, and they chose from this cosmopolitan population, chose children of different ancestries. That's what we have, and we're working on the DNA right now. I'm not, but we have an expert out at UC Santa Cruz, Lars Ferenc-Schmitz, who is doing massive DNA studies on New World populations, and he's working on these to see if he can distinguish different groups, and so we're still waiting to see how that comes out. But that would be evidence that would support the idea that if or not, depending on how it comes out.
Definitely. I think that maybe potentially listeners might wonder what it's like to work with so many human remains of children, especially in such large quantities. Like, does that affect you, or is it just another day in the lab?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I get asked that occasionally. Now, Gabriel has 2 young sons, and every now and then when he's talking about this site, he talks about, I have a son who's 5, and I have a son who's 3. These children, by the way, were between about 5 and 11, 12, 13 years. So they were in that range. No infants and no older teenagers. So they were kind of children's age that you could put them in elementary school somehow. To be honest, and I guess it's partly because for all these years working with bones as a student, graduate student, and then professional, it's kind of my daily thing. And for me, I guess the parallel would be a little bit like being a forensic pathologist doing autopsies. You learn to kind of distance yourself from emotional involvement while you're working. I have great interest in what this is, and mainly what I'm focusing on is trying to figure out what it's all about. So I usually don't think about some things that others might think about, like what would it feel like to have your chest cut open, and how awful that would be for a child. It wouldn't be good for anyone, but for a child it would be pretty traumatic. And I don't have children myself, so I don't look at them and think about, oh, that could be my son or my daughter. But some people might think, well, gosh, don't you have any sensitivity? Well, I'll tell you one real short story. The only time I had a real creepy feeling was I was in Douglas Hubelacher's outer office. He was my advisor when I was at the Smithsonian. And he had a forensic case of two teenage kids from the U.S. somewhere. The young woman had gotten into a drug deal that went bad. I guess she hadn't paid for her drugs. And so the drug dealer called her out to a remote area, and she brought her boyfriend along. They were both murdered. And so in the box with 2 skeletons were tennis shoes and some items of clothing. And for some reason, I walked in that office that night. I just had a creepy feeling. It said something really bad happened here. And I don't know what that was, some kind of intuition. Maybe because of the tennis shoes and the modern context, it had more immediacy for me than it would if with these children and with sacrifices I've studied of warriors, captives, and so on. So I guess the long time distance, as well as just the interest that I really have and my students have on seeing this stuff and going, wow, this is interesting. And we kind of don't think about the dark side of it.
No, I get it. I think that they're having dealt with both kinds of samples. I agree with you. I think that forensic contexts feel much more immediate, especially when you know that there are people out there who remember this person alive. and the person who hurt the body that you see in front of you, like that person is still out there. It feels very different than something that happened 500 years ago. But I know that not all anthropologists feel that way either. So I think it's just a good thing to talk about.
Yes, and one other thing I should mention is it's the context of the death. In the case of these two young people, it was a violent and tragic death for them. They were murdered. In the case of the children and other sacrifices I've worked with, I know they were embedded in a culture that probably told them, we're giving the greatest gift we can give to the gods to stop the rains, and that there is great honor in you being sacrificed. Whether the children would be convinced of that or their parents, hard to know, but it is known that the Inca sacrificed children, these high-altitude Capacocha children, and that sometimes, according to what the Spanish were told by the Inca, parents would sometimes give their child away because it was such a great honor, and by giving their child to the Inca emperor indirectly through this sacrifice, they were currying favor. They might raise their social status, but also they would be seen as giving something of great value. So those are kind of, in a sense, semi-voluntary deaths. And like the Aztec sacrifices, my wife studies the Aztecs. And, one of the most glorious deaths was to either die on the battlefield for men, die on the battlefield, or be sacrificed on the sacrificial stone, because you went to the highest level of heaven. There are many cultures that have these stories like that. If you die this way, you're going to live forever in a beautiful afterlife. And so some of the people marching up those temples to have their hearts cut out might actually have thought this is a great thing. And, once I'm through this, it'll all be good. Kind of like going to the dentist or the doctor. Yeah. Well.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about. It's very alien from our modern experience. So, well, at least when I say our, I mean ours. I don't know. I feel like there are cults and whatnot that are replicating that experience for people. But that gets into a whole nother territory.
That does, yeah. And thankfully, that's not my area, satanic killings and all that stuff. Yeah. But no, it's a good point. But I think for the average person today, yeah, death is something we rarely see. And certainly none of us see it go to a place like Disney World where they have human sacrifice. And don't get that idea at Disney World. If they did, then people could see it and find it fascinating. And we don't have a Colosseum like in ancient Rome where you could have fights between Christians and lions. So we don't get that kind of spectacular death for the public. So yeah, we're not used to death in that sense.
Yeah, certainly. Well, I don't want to take up too much of your time. I feel like I could probably spend all afternoon talking to you.
Well, you're nice, and I could spend the whole afternoon talking to you, and you'd say, will you stop? I have a job, I have things to do. No, I enjoy talking to you, and I think we've touched on some interesting topics. You have interesting questions, and so I've enjoyed talking to you.
Certainly. I really hope that you'll come back on, because we didn't even get to the trepanation, and I really want to talk to you about trepanation. But
yeah, that is another story. Yeah, and that would be fun, because then we could talk about it in terms of medical history and surgery and the history of that kind of thing.
Okay, so just you wait. I'm going to come back to New Orleans. Okay, so it is time for the end of the interview, which is where I ask my 3 questions about books and entertainment. Are you ready?
I think I'm ready.
Okay.
Yeah.
If someone wanted to learn more about what you do, about your particular area of study, where would be a good place for them to start?
Well, there are some popular magazines that cover things like Archaeology Magazine, National Geographic. I've been in a number of issues, and they did one on this human sacrifice. They've done 2 on them now, I think. So there's some popular literature. I could always say, well, you could Google things, you could search for things on the web, but then you might get ancient astronauts and aliens and get distracted by that. I always have to be fighting against that, because they often focus on skulls from areas where I work. There are, of course, scientific organizations like the Paleopathology Association, which I belong to, and on their webpage they talk about what is paleopathology, what are some of the things we study, what are some of the links. They have links to what meetings are there, lectures and other things. The same to a certain degree, if you're interested in forensic anthropology or even forensic entomology, studying insects from forensic contexts, if you Google those things, there are kind of a number of websites that are good at explaining just the basics. What is forensic anthropology? What do they do? And so on. Also, what programs would I study if I wanted to be one? Those things are good.
Okay.
I don't need to send anyone to my webpage because I don't need to self-promote, but if they Google johnverano.com, I've put all of my publications that I can have as PDFs. I've put them up there, as well as some pictures of my field work in different places. So, or they could look into local organizations like archaeology clubs or archaeological societies of different states if they want to get out there and volunteer and be on a dig. That's one way to get your hands dirty.
That's a great idea. No one has mentioned that yet, but that is actually something that I have seen personally when I've been in the field. We've had volunteers come out, and some of them have. I remember we worked with this one guy who knew everything there was to know about buttons. And it was amazing. Like, we found a button and he was like, "Oh, I believe this is the manufacturer, made in this date range, and so this burial is probably from this time." And I mean, we knew we were doing a historic 19th century burial, but it was just wild.
Yeah, you never know. And there's some who just have good basic skills like mapping or engineering or logistics or something like that. So, yeah, and I've been on some volunteer things years ago, state archaeologist of Virginia, some things in California when I was in college, and it's fun, and they can often use helpers.
Mm-hmm. So what are you reading for work right now?
Well, I haven't started reading it yet, but I just downloaded a new article by one of my recent PhDs, who's now at University of Central Florida, on estimating stature of ancient Andean people in the highlands, and that's great. I look forward to that. I've been reading a book by one of my professors. It's the proof pages of a real incredibly fancy tomb that was found in Peru. It was looted, but he's reconstructed as best he can all of the items, as many of these he could find that came out of that tomb. And it's amazing. I mean, it's just these endless gold crowns and nose ornaments and everything else. So I've been reading that. I've been, I read articles. I'm asked to review articles, and when I have time, I do that. And then I'm trying to do a little bit of just personal reading every now and then. I was trying to read historian Matthew Restall's book, When Cortez Met Montezuma, which is a kind of a semi-popular historic account of the conquest of the Aztecs. And I have a book in there on how to be more efficient in work and life. I like self-help books. I've always liked them. And I have some books on meditation there, too. I've always liked meditation.
And is that what you're reading for fun right now?
Yeah, that's kind of for fun. Also, though, I just got off some flights to Cuba and back for a conference, and I tried to take a book that was not totally academic, and it's called All That Remains. It's a life and death. It's written by a British woman who's a forensic anthropologist, and it won all kinds of accolades in the UK. And it's a very personal account of death in her family and her career and everything else. So it was written pleasantly enough that it wasn't a kind of a depressing thing to read on an airplane. So I didn't go, oh my God.
I have to say that there's something about airplanes that make me cry. Like I watched Aquaman with, the new one with Jason Momoa, and I sobbed during that movie. And I'm like, I don't understand why I'm crying. This movie, is it because the movie's bad? I don't know.
I don't know either. Music will make me cry. Classical music or just a beautiful piece make me, shed a few tears, and it's kind of embarrassing because, I don't know what it is, but it just stirs that. Movies on planes usually not, because usually they're pretty awful. I was watching a zombie movie last time, and I just thought, this is horrific. It was a takeoff on zombie films called The Dead Never Die with Bill Murray and some really other great stars. But some of the stuff they show on the planes, I'm thinking, you're kidding.
That's what I'm saying. I'm like watching these movies, and they're not sad movies, and I'm crying.
Well, I would say talk to your professional, talk to your therapist.
It's just on planes, so I'm not that worried about it. But
no, that's interesting. So it's situational.
Yeah.
Well, I guess as long as you can avoid sobbing out loud, because that can upset the other.
Well, that's the worst part. Is you're sitting there and you're crying, and then the person looks over to see what you're watching. Like they think you're going to watch like Marley and Me or some sad dog movie, and It's Aquaman.
Well, as I said, you may need to talk to a therapist. So
anyway, so thank you so much for sharing with me, and I will be in touch.
Good talking to you.
Good talking to you too. Thanks for joining me for this episode of the Anthrobiology Podcast. If you have questions or comments, you can reach me at gabby.lapera@anthrobiology.com. That's spelled GABY.LAPERA@anthrobiology.com. This show was produced and edited by me. Music courtesy of Chad Crouch, aka Poddington Bear at Sound of Picture.